Joining us here in Washington is Mann Leverett. She's a visiting scholar at Georgetown University and a former US negotiator with Iran. And with us from Vienna is Mohammad Marandi. He's the Dean of the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Doctor, I'd like to start with you because you are right there where the action or inaction is in Vienna. Just bring us up to date. How close are we to a deal? What's the feeling like on the ground?
Well, it's very difficult to really figure out what's going on because everything is being discussed behind closed doors. There are lots of rumors. Some say they're close, but at the same time, they say there are some important differences between the two sides. The disagreements, of course, from the very beginning were more or less between Iran and the United States. France, Britain, and Germany have not really played a very important role. Even France, despite the fact that the French foreign minister has made some statements in the past, but at the negotiating table, it's really been between Iran and the United States for the most part. But apparently, they've reached an agreement on large segments of the text. But you know, it's the last things that remain that are sometimes the most difficult, and I think that this is true for this current situation as well.
Mann Leverett, what are these sticking points, and can we get over them?
Right now, the specific sticking points seem to be, and of course, you have to caveat that with everything is reported as a rumor, seem to really relate to the prospective UN Security Council resolution that would endorse any prospective deal.
So we're talking about lifting of sanctions, timing.
Yes. Well, specifically, what had been the U.S. insertion of a specific restriction on weapon sales from Iran and dealing with missile parts. That seems to be the specific area that they are stuck on at this point. But there's a broader issue where the deal can go up and down related to these two issues. The United States wants to retain some sort of dominance in the Middle East and globally. So that's an issue vis-a-vis Iran, but that's also an issue vis-a-vis Russia, which is why the issue of the arms embargo is so important, because this is something that Russia also cares about. Iran, of course, in my view, would like to assert as much independence as it can in these negotiations and for its current and future role in the region. There is a real barrier between the U.S. goal of dominance and the Iranian goal of independence. Whether that can be bridged, I think, is the crucial question of these negotiations. The parties have come very far. I think there's a strategic logic for it to happen, but whether it can happen tonight or in 24 hours is, of course, the million-dollar question.
Dr. Marandi, Mann Leverett talks of a strategic logic, even inevitability. What is the upside of this deal for Tehran and Washington and the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's obvious that a deal would be good for everyone, especially now that the region is facing so much uncertainty, and now that extremist groups, Wahhabi groups, such as the Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and ISIL, as well as Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and others are all have become very powerful and effective forces. It is time for the international community and regional powers to come together to find a solution. But it's a fact that the United States really, at least from our perspective, from an Iranian perspective, that the United States is psychologically attached to these sanctions and the sanctions regime. And it's very difficult for the United States to give them up. The Iranians are saying that the only way that we can have a deal is for all the UN sanctions to be removed, and that all the American sanctions that are linked to the nuclear program to be removed as well. Otherwise, there's no chance for an agreement. The Iranians know that if we have an agreement and some of the sanctions do remain, then ultimately they will never go away, because the Americans are not going to come back to the negotiating table over those issues. So the Iranians are saying, we get it, if we are going to have a deal, we have to have a comprehensive one. It can be done in phases. We can begin, for example, with banking and finance, and then military sanctions could be solved at a later date. But it's ironic that the Americans want military sanctions against Iran at a time when it's Iran that's doing the main fighting against ISIL and Al-Qaeda.
Dr. Marandi, I just want you to explain a bit more about this, because even though these negotiations are about Iran's nuclear program, there is this big carrot, isn't there, of US-Iranian cooperation when it comes to fighting the groups that you've just been talking about. Even though they're separate from these negotiations, that's very much a feeling in Vienna that this could be a game changer if this deal is done in terms of the regional dynamics, correct?
Well, it's a possibility. If you recall, just a few weeks back, Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranian leader, said very specifically that if the United States can come to a reasonable agreement with Iran, if they can come to respect Iran at the nuclear negotiating table and to come and to do a deal with Iran that the Iranians believe is a good deal, then that would be sort of a litmus test. And then the Iranians could begin thinking about talking with the United States about other issues in the region. Of course, that would include discussions with regards to extremism. The Iranians believe that the Americans have basically become, because of their hostility towards Iran, have become very over-reliant on their regional allies. Countries like Turkey, which is from, according to the Iranians, supporting both Al-Qaeda, meaning the Nusra Front, and ISIL alongside the border, and then Saudi Arabia, Qatar, which are not only funding Al-Qaeda in Syria and in other parts of the region, but also they're feeding the Wahhabi extremist ideology. And of course, we know that the Israelis too have been helping the Nusra Front on their border. So the Iranians feel that if the Americans are able to do this deal and look at Iran through a different light and move towards rapprochement, maybe they would be able to change their policy and to put pressure on their allies to stop funding these groups, and this may ease tensions and weaken the extremists.
Mann Leverett, pick up on that, because, you know, the US has always framed this as allowing Iran potentially to come back into the community of nations after decades of being on the sidelines. But what Dr. Marandi is suggesting is that actually the US in the region of the Greater Middle East needs Iran right now more than the other way around. Is that right?
Yes, and in two ways. I think very much the way that Dr. Marandi laid out. Iran would be vital for any U.S. effort for stabilization in the Middle East, for conflict resolution in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, for example. And I worked with Iranian officials to do that over Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11 from 2001 to 2003, and that was a very successful discussion that the parties had over Afghanistan. But I think even more importantly, a deal with Iran could open the door to a real, genuine, different policy by the United States toward the Middle East. And by that, I mean a U.S. policy that is not focused on arming, training, and funding radical jihadis throughout the Middle East, arming to the teeth our so-called allies like the Saudis and the Israelis, and instead having a much more balanced approach to the Middle East. That includes Iran, but not first and foremost to work with them side by side in fighting ISIS or ISIL, but actually in de-escalating tensions in the region, curbing those $100 billion arms sales to the Persian Gulf. That would contribute enormously to a more stable environment in the region.
So you're talking about a regional security that involves allies that the US has, but also potentially bringing in Iran and others as well. But the deal isn't done yet. And the US President, Barack Obama, said he'll walk away from any bad deal. The US Congress is champing at the bit to kill parts or all of this deal. Israel very much involved as well. So that there is, even though there may be optimism in Vienna, here in Washington, it's not done.
That's true. I think that the so-called hardliners that many in Washington speak about in Iran, we really need to put the camera right here in Washington, where there are not just the so-called hardliners, but even those who portray themselves as progressive, that are threatening to walk away. In my view, a decision to walk away, a U.S. decision to walk away from negotiations with Iran would be just as disastrous strategically for the United States, if not more so, than the decision to invade Iraq, which completely upturned the political and security order in the region. It would be that strategically disastrous for the United States. And you hear that not just from the so-called hardliners on the right wing of the Republican Party, but from President Obama himself. It would be strategically disastrous for us, but that may be the road we're going on. They may try to come to a compromised middle ground, which I think would also be very damaging for the United States in the region. region, which would be, well, not to walk away, but to postpone yet again. This would
kick the can down the road again.
Kick the can down the road, but that would only serve to further delegitimate any prospective deal and have the knives really sharpened for 2016 here for the presidential race.
Dr. Marandi, I just want to bring you in quickly here because Hillary Mann Leverett was talking about the reticence here in the US, but of course Israel as well. We've seen the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say there's daily concessions to the P5 from the P5+1 to Iran. What's your view on Israel's role in all this?
Well, the Israelis are, alongside the Saudis, are doing their best to wreck any agreement, because I think in Tehran the view is that the Israeli regime thrives on instability in this part of the world. That's how they dominate the land surrounding them. But I think it's becoming clearer by the day in the eyes of many that U.S. interests really lie in rapprochement. And the United States not only needs Iran for regional security today, but we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in countries like Saudi Arabia. If, for example, Saudi Arabia shows signs of weakness, and it is an inherently unstable regime with a ruling family, then Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, all of them would grow unstable. So the United States needs Iran not only to push to re-stabilize the region, but also if there is further instability and where things could get much worse, Iran would even become more important. The United States, it doesn't want to bring Iran back into the international community. They don't. The Iranians feel that they've always been at in the heart of the international community. The United States needs Iran for its own interests, and the Iranians recognize that. The Iranians want a deal, but the Iranians know that the United States needs Iran just as much as Iran needs the United States, and therefore the Iranians are willing to wait for a very long time to get a right deal. But hopefully the United States will move in the right direction, and we may have something soon.
Dr. Marandi, stay right there in Vienna. We need to take a break, but more of our conversation right after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.